Winter had always cloaked the world in silence, but this January, the quiet seemed heavier, almost oppressive. Snowflakes swirled lazily outside the frosted window panes, and I could hear the faint creak of footsteps as Alex, my son, paced in the hallway. He had come home 2 weeks ago, home from the battlefield, carrying more than just the visible scars of war. The doctors said it was shell shock. They told me to be patient, to give him time. But the Alex who walked through my front door wasn't the boy I had raised. He was a man now, broad-shouldered and quiet, his eyes shadowed by memories he didn't share. He looked at me differently, with a mix of protectiveness and tenderness that made my heart ache. "Mom," he'd say, his voice soft yet steady. But there was no recognition, not really. Sometimes I wondered if he even remembered I was his mother. He treated me with care, yes, as if I were something precious and fragile, but it was more than that, something deeper, more complicated. This morning I was peeling potatoes in the kitchen when Alex came in. The way his presence filled the room was both comforting and unsettling. He leaned against the counter, watching me in silence, his arms crossed. "Do you need help?" he asked finally, his voice low. I smiled, shaking my head. "I'm just about done. But thank you." He stayed, not moving, just watching. There was something about his gaze that felt unfamiliar, something more searching than a son's casual glance. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and turned to face him. "Alex," I began, trying to tread carefully. "How are you feeling today?" His jaw tightened slightly, and he exhaled through his nose. "Better, I guess." Then, after a pause, "It's easier when I'm here. With you." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing against the walls of the small kitchen. My hands fidgeted with the towel, unsure how to respond. Was this simply gratitude, or was it something else? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. That evening, as the snowstorm raged outside, we sat together on the couch, a warm blanket draped across our laps. Alex had insisted on lighting a fire in the hearth, the soft crackle of the flames filling the silence between us. "Do you remember the winters when Dad was alive?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Course. You'd beg him to build snow forts, and he'd always pretend to grumble, but he loved it as much as you did." Alex smiled faintly, his gaze distant. "He'd make sure they were big enough for both of us. He said it was our fortress, that we had to protect you." My breath caught. The memory was bittersweet, tinged with the ache of loss. "He loved you so much," I murmured, brushing a strand of hair from my face. Alex turned to me then, his eyes searching mine in a way that made my chest tighten. "And I love you, Mom. More than you know." I smiled, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I know, Alex. I love you too." But as our hands lingered, I realized the line between mother and son had become blurred. The bond between us deepened by his need for comfort and my inability to push him away. It was a dangerous, delicate dance, one I wasn't sure either of us was ready to navigate. The firelight flickered, casting shadows across the room, and I wondered if this house, our home, could hold the weight of everything we were both carrying. The storm outside howled, but inside there was only warmth, and a tension I couldn't quite name. Winter nights had a way of wrapping the world in stillness, as if time itself held its breath. The snow fell relentlessly outside, layering the ground in shimmering white. Inside, the warmth of the fire radiated through the living room, but it wasn't enough to chase away the unease that had settled in my chest. Alex had been acting different. Not in a way I could easily name, but in a way that I couldn't ignore. There were times when he seemed to forget who I was. Not entirely, but in the moments when his gaze lingered too long or when his voice softened as he spoke to me, I wasn't just Mom. I could feel it in the way he complimented me, casually at first, then more pointedly. "You look beautiful tonight," he'd said just the other day. His tone light but his eyes too intense. I'd laughed it off, brushing the comment aside. "This old sweater." "Hardly." "No, really," he pressed. "You have this way about you, like you don't even realize how amazing you are." I didn't know how to respond. He said it so earnestly, so genuinely, that I couldn't dismiss it entirely. He had always been caring, but now there was something else, a layer of attention that felt far too intimate for a son. One evening, the storm outside knocked the power out. The entire house plunged into darkness. I fumbled my way to the kitchen, finding matches and lighting a few candles. The warm glow flickered against the walls, softening the sharp edges of reality. "Got any mulled wine left?" Alex called from the living room. I smiled to myself, glad for the normalcy of the question. "Think so. I'll heat some up on the stove." Soon, the scent of spices filled the air, cinnamon and cloves mingling with the faint smell of pine from the wreath on the mantel. I carried the steaming mugs into the living room, where Alex was lighting more candles. His broad frame moved through the shadows with ease, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He looked so much like his father had at that age. Strong, steady, with a quiet kind of charm that seemed effortless. "Here," I said, handing him a mug. "Thanks," he replied, taking it from me. Our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the mulled wine. We settled onto the couch, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on his face. The storm outside raged on, but inside it felt cocooned, almost safe. He sipped his wine in silence for a while before finally speaking. "Do you ever think about the past, Mom?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. "All the time," I admitted, curling my legs beneath me. "It's hard not to, especially this time of year." "Yeah," he said, staring into his mug. "Me too." The silence between us stretched, not awkward but heavy, like we were both teetering on the edge of something unsaid. "Sometimes," he began, his voice hesitant, "I feel like I'm searching for something I'll never find." I frowned, turning to look at him. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly before he spoke. I want someone like you." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Like me?" He nodded, his eyes locking onto mine. "You're strong. Kind. You don't even realize how incredible you are. I don't know if anyone could ever live up to that." The weight of his words settled between us, heavy and charged. My pulse quickened as I searched his face for some hint that he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But his expression was serious, his gaze unwavering. "Alex," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing mine where it rested on the couch. "Mean it, Mom. You've set the standard so high. I don't know if anyone else could ever make me feel the way you do." I pulled my hand back, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're still healing," I said, my voice trembling. "You've been through so much, Alex. It's natural to feel close to the people who are here for you." "It's not just that," he said, shaking his head. "It's more than that. You make me feel safe. Seen." His words hung in the air, their weight impossible to ignore. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, to dismiss the moment as nothing more than misplaced emotions. But the way he looked at me, the vulnerability in his eyes, made it clear that he meant every word. "We should get some sleep," I said finally, standing and collecting the mugs. My hands shook as I carried them to the kitchen, the warmth of the wine still lingering in my chest. When I returned, Alex was still sitting on the couch, his head tilted back against the cushion, eyes closed. For a moment, I watched him, my heart heavy with a mix of love and confusion. He was my son, but in moments like this, he felt like so much more. It scared me, the way the boundaries between us seemed to blur, but I couldn't deny the connection we shared. A connection that was both beautiful and deeply, dangerously complicated. Sleep eluded me that night, my thoughts a tangled web of emotions and memories. Alex's words replayed in my mind like a song on repeat. "You make me feel safe. Seen." The sincerity in his voice, the intensity in his eyes. It wasn't something I could brush aside. A part of me wanted to dismiss it, to blame his feelings on the trauma he had endured, but another part, a quieter, more dangerous part, felt warm and alive in a way I hadn't in years. I hated myself for lingering on his words, for savoring the feeling they evoked in me. Yet I couldn't stop. Alone in the quiet dark, I traced my finger along the edge of the blanket and wondered what it all meant, what we had become. The boundaries between us were shifting, and I was terrified of where it might lead. But deep down, I couldn't deny the thrill of it. By morning, the weight of my restlessness had transformed into something strange and unfamiliar. A spark, a desire to feel seen. I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, brushing out my hair, carefully applying makeup I hadn't touched in months. I chose a fitted sweater, soft and warm, and paired it with a skirt I hadn't worn in years. Even my heels, which had been collecting dust in the closet, made an appearance. When I came downstairs, Alex was already in the kitchen, sipping coffee at the counter. He turned at the sound of my footsteps, and the expression on his face was worth every extra minute I'd spent getting ready. His eyes widened, his lips parting slightly as if he were about to speak but had forgotten the words. "Wow," he said finally, his voice tinged with awe. "Mom, you look amazing." Heat rose to my cheeks and I smiled, feeling both embarrassed and flattered. "Oh, it's nothing," I said, waving a hand dismissively. "I just thought I'd try something different today." "It suits you," he said, his gaze lingering on me. "You look younger." I laughed lightly, brushing off the compliment. "Well, that's a nice way of saying I usually look like a tired old lady." "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "That's not what I meant. You're beautiful. Always have been." His words were so earnest, so genuine, that I couldn't help but believe him. Throughout the morning, Alex seemed unable to stop staring at me, and each time our eyes met, he smiled, a boyish, almost shy smile that made my heart flutter in a way it shouldn't. He teased me playfully, making little jokes about how I must be trying to impress someone. When I asked who, he shrugged with a mischievous grin. "Maybe me," he said, his tone light but his eyes heavy with meaning. I didn't know how to respond, so I busied myself with chores, hoping the movement would steady my thoughts. But Alex stayed close, offering to help with everything, setting the table, folding laundry, even sweeping the floors. His presence was magnetic, and every time he reached past me or brushed against me, I felt a spark, an electricity I couldn't ignore. That afternoon, while I was tidying up the living room, Alex came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. The gesture was gentle, affectionate, and yet it felt different than it had before. His touch lingered just a second too long, and the warmth of his body against mine sent a shiver down my spine. "You've been working too hard," he said softly, his breath warm against my ear. "You deserve to relax." I tilted my head to look at him, my heart pounding. "And who's going to do all this if I don't?" He grinned, his face so close to mine that I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. "Me, of course. You just sit back and enjoy being spoiled for once." I laughed, gently patting his arm. "You're sweet, Alex. But I think you forget I've been taking care of things for a long time." "Maybe it's my turn now," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He leaned down and kissed my cheek, the touch of his lips soft and lingering. It was such a simple gesture, yet it left me breathless. Later that evening, while I was preparing dinner, Alex disappeared for a while. When he returned, he was holding a small bouquet of flowers, simple but beautiful, a mix of daisies and wildflowers. My heart skipped a beat as he held them out to me, a sheepish smile on his face. "For you," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shy. "I just thought. You deserve them." I stared at the flowers, overwhelmed by the gesture. "Alex. You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said simply. "You do so much for everyone else. I wanted to do something for you." I took the bouquet, my fingers brushing against his as I did. "Thank you," I said softly, my voice catching. "They're lovely." "You're lovely," he replied, his gaze steady and intense. I turned away, busying myself with finding a vase for the flowers. My hands shook as I arranged them, the petals soft and fragrant beneath my fingers. I could feel Alex watching me, his presence like a warm flame that both comforted and unsettled me. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the way he had looked at me, the way he had spoken to me. His words, his gestures, they were filled with a care and tenderness that went beyond anything I had ever expected. And as much as I tried to push the thoughts away, I couldn't help but feel a dangerous thrill at the closeness we shared. The lines between us were blurring, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength or the desire to redraw them. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, painting golden streaks across the wooden floor. I woke to the faint sound of music drifting up from the kitchen, something light and melodic, the kind of tune that made you sway without realizing it. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but the rich, comforting aroma of coffee quickly dispelled that idea. I slipped on my robe and made my way downstairs, the warm notes of the melody growing clearer with each step. When I entered the kitchen, I stopped in my tracks, momentarily taken aback by the sight in front of me. Alex was at the stove, his back to me as he worked with practiced ease. He was humming softly, a sound that mixed seamlessly with the music. A plate of fresh fruit sat on the counter, alongside a small vase with one of the daisies from the bouquet he'd given me the day before. The sight made my heart swell. "Good morning," I said, my voice soft but filled with warmth. Alex turned, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Good morning, beautiful," he replied without hesitation, his grin boyish and unguarded. I flushed, shaking my head as I stepped closer. "What's all this?" "Breakfast," he said simply, motioning to the sizzling pan on the stove. "I figured you deserved to be spoiled today." "And," he added, gesturing toward the small speaker on the counter, "a little music to start the day off right." I laughed softly, leaning against the counter as I watched him. "You're really outdoing yourself lately." He glanced over his shoulder, his expression playful. "Maybe I just like seeing you smile." His words hung in the air, and I felt a familiar warmth creep into my chest. There was no teasing in his tone, no coyness, just sincerity. It was disarming as always, and I found myself smiling despite my efforts to play it cool. "Breakfast is almost ready," he said, turning back to the stove. "But first..." He stepped away from the stove, wiping his hands on a towel before holding one out to me. "Dance with me." I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" "Dance with me," he repeated, his hand still extended. The music swelled in the background, a lively yet intimate tune that seemed to echo his request. His smile was inviting, his eyes filled with a mischief that was impossible to resist. I hesitated for only a moment before placing my hand in his. His fingers curled around mine, warm and firm, and he pulled me gently into the center of the room. "Alex," I began, my voice tinged with laughter, "it's too early for this." "Never too early," he countered, spinning me lightly before pulling me close. "Besides, you're always telling me to enjoy the moment. So here I am." The dance started awkwardly, my feet unsure, his movements slightly too bold, but soon we found a rhythm. He twirled me with surprising grace, his laughter infectious as I stumbled once or twice. By the time the song reached its chorus, we were both smiling so broadly that my cheeks began to ache. "You're a terrible dancer," I teased, laughing as he tried to dip me dramatically. "Rude," he replied, his grin widening. "I'm an excellent dancer. It's you who keeps stepping on my feet." "Me?" I scoffed, swatting his shoulder lightly. "I'm flawless." He laughed, the sound warm and rich, and spun me one last time before pulling me closer. This time our movements slowed, the playful energy giving way to something quieter, more intimate. His hand rested lightly on my waist, his other hand still clasping mine. The music softened, the notes fading into the background, but neither of us let go. He leaned down, brushing a kiss against my cheek, his lips lingering for just a moment. When he pulled back, his arms wrapped around me in a hug that was both tender and unyielding. For a long while we stayed like that, swaying gently as if the music hadn't stopped. His embrace was warm and grounding, and I found myself leaning into him, my head resting lightly against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath my ear, a calming rhythm that matched the peace I felt in that moment. "You feel so good," he murmured softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, afraid that words might break whatever spell had woven itself around us. Instead, I closed my eyes, allowing myself to savor the closeness, the safety of his arms. It was a moment I didn't want to end. When he finally pulled back, his hands lingered on my arms, his gaze searching mine. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something that made my breath catch. But before I could say anything, he smiled, the expression so open and warm that it melted away any tension. "Breakfast is going to burn," he said, his voice light but his tone still carrying the weight of the moment. I laughed softly, stepping back to let him return to the stove. "Wouldn't want that." As he turned his attention back to the food, I found myself watching him, my heart still racing from the dance, the hug, the kiss on the cheek. Everything about Alex felt different. Or maybe it was me who had changed. Either way, I couldn't deny the pull between us, the way our connection had deepened in ways I hadn't thought possible. By the time we sat down to eat, the lightheartedness had returned, and we chatted easily about everything and nothing. But beneath the surface, there was a new layer to our bond, something tender and delicate, yet undeniable. And as he reached across the table to brush a crumb from my lip, his touch lingering just a moment too long, I knew we had crossed into uncharted territory. There was no going back now, and a part of me wasn't sure I wanted to.